Welcome to the Future of Internal Communication podcast. I'm Jen Sproul, CEO of the Institute of Internal Communication. Our organisations continue to face an onslaught of challenges, and the way we work requires dramatic transformation and response. Internal communication is a crucial function that helps organisations achieve lasting change. It's also the glue that holds organisations together in hybrid and distributed working environments. This podcast explores opportunity for internal communicators in the future of work. The world is changing, and so must we. We hope you really enjoy listening.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Future of Internal Communication podcast. I am Kat Barnard, as ever joined by Jennifer Sproul and Dominic Walters. Today we are going to talk about a topic that has come up within our membership community as something that we need to prioritise in 2025, and that is the topic of burnout. And I see, feel and hear that in the sense that I think most people at work right now are completely struggling to make sense of the world as it is, not least since the 20th of January, where we are just being bombarded relentlessly with information about who's said what, who's done what international relationships are going to look like politically moving forward. All that to say, I think burnout has probably been on the rise, maybe a little bit under the radar since the pandemic, actually. And just to reinforce that, I just wanted to take the opportunity to refer to some data points that the UK Health and Safety Executive published in late last year. So according to the HSE, 16.4 million working days were lost in the 23-24 period due to work-related stress, depression, or anxiety. And so to put that in context, of the 1.7 million working people suffering from a work-related illness, 776,000, that is 46%, were suffering from work-related stress, depression, or anxiety. Now, those are the recorded numbers. Those are the numbers that the Health and Safety Executive knows about. And I'm imagining that that is because people who have been impacted have been brave enough to go to their GP and seek external help and support. But clearly, we've got an undocumented kind of another pandemic on our hands. Clearly, there is a big issue here. I have felt for quite some time that anybody that is working in the people space at work, so anybody tasked with the responsibility of people policies, team cohesion, internal communication also, anybody that is trying to create kind of the cultural glue that helps people stick together in times of challenge and adversity, I would imagine that they are at the forefront of work-related pressures. So today's episode, I really want to dive into that. I want to dive into it because there's enough data out there to evidence what causes work-related stress. And we know that stress is harmful to human health. And we also know now, because people are brave enough to talk about it, that it does lead to burnout. So in essence, what I want to talk about today is let's get our heads around the topic of burnout a little bit more, and let's talk about what can be done, what we can do, not necessarily to fix others, because I'm not asking anybody that works in internal communication to add that to another long task list of to-dos. I'm talking about you guys. If you're feeling stressed and anxious because of your workload, because you are being asked to do more with less, because you are worried about whether or not your organisation might need to make redundancies in the coming year, this episode is for you and hopefully will prove helpful to you in some way, because I think we need to talk about it. Until we're talking about it, we can't really do anything about it. So that was a bit long-winded, bear with me. I'd now like to introduce you to somebody that I've had the privilege of knowing for 30 years. I'd like to introduce you to Tracey Hewett. And she is a work-life coach and wellness speaker who specialises in burnout prevention and recovery. She has a mission to change the way we think about self-care and encourages everybody to put themselves at the top of their to-do list, which I think is rather lovely. So she's been since 2017. So what is that? Can't do my maths. 7, going on 8 years now. She's been helping people and organisations proactively safeguard well-being, manage stress and avoid burnout. Prior to all of that, she has a background in stakeholder engagement and worked in the marine sector for 2 decades before moving full-time into employee well-being. So, Tracey, thank you for coming and talking with us today about this topic. I knew, when I started to think about this bubbling up as an issue for internal communicators, I was thinking who would be good to bring on, and immediately you were on my radar, and apologies that I've stalked you and coerced you into coming and chatting with us today. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here.
I realise this is a very lofty, wieldy topic, but I would love you to kick off with an explainer, actually, because I think we tend to talk about a lot of these things very conceptually, and we don't always necessarily have the time to dig deep into what things mean. So you're working in this space. What is burnout?
Okay, so a very good place to start. For me, I always go to the World Health Organization's definition for 2 reasons. One, that it's really simple and it's a really easy thing to unpack. So what the World Health Organization says is that burnout is a syndrome that results from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Now, the reason I really like that definition is its usefulness, because it gives us a context, it's work-related. It gives us a cause, it's chronic work-related stress. And it gives us the word syndrome, which is a group of symptoms which consistently occur together. And what they characterize burnout with is 3 aspects. One is mental and physical exhaustion, so complete energy depletion. Also a sense of mental detachment from your role. And that can be coupled with cynicism or negative thoughts about your role or even about your colleagues. And then the third aspect is a low sense of efficacy, so your ability to do your job. So you may actually be capable of doing your job and people may not be noticing any difference, but you will have a sense of ineffectiveness and almost futility.
So immediately that you set that out, my mind is going to what we collectively understand as engagement or disengagement. Actually, some of the manifestations and symptoms that you've described there play totally into how, for instance, Gallup would describe disengagement. And so immediately, I think, my goodness me, in unprecedentedly challenging economic times, it behooves any organisation to put the topic of burnout onto its kind of board agenda, because it links so closely with disengagement. If you've got people working in your organisation who are properly in this zone, you're effectively trying to drive a car up the M6 when you've got no fuel in your tank.
Right, great observation, Kat. One of the models that we use to look at burnout, Demaruti's model, is the job demands resources model. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but against your demands, so all the things that draw from you are all the things that can resource you. And those things that can resource you are supportive colleagues, a good relationship with your manager, role clarity, all of those aspects that also, if you get them right, give you engagement. So there's two pathways with that job demand resources model. If the demands are greater than your resources, you're on a pathway to burnout, and likely people are going to start quitting. But if your resources are sufficient or greater than, then you're on a pathway to engagement. And which business doesn't want engagement? So yeah, great observation. And it is like a seesaw.
And without dwelling on it too much, I know you've got personal experience of burnout. What do you wish you had known about it before you experienced it? Because it's one of these things, isn't it? I feel like we've made leaps and bounds of progress in the last decade in terms of our willingness to talk about hitherto kind of almost taboo subjects, things like, I don't know, menopause or mental health. Actually, a decade ago, were we talking about mental health generally in the workplace? I don't think we necessarily were, even though it's not a modern thing that people suffer work-related stress. It's been going on for several decades. It's just that we have made progress in our ability to have open conversations about it more recently. So knowing what you know now, I know this is a bit of maybe a roundabout question, but knowing what you know now, what do you wish you would have known before you had your own experience of it?
Okay, so I reflected, and you might remember I wrote a blog about the 19 lessons that I learned from burning out. But the main one that I would point to is that the recognition that the things that we do in our leisure time, so outside of work, are not just nice to do's. They're not just things that we do to fill our time. They're actually really necessary activities, and they help us recover and ready ourselves for the next push the next day. So my story of burnout is I was doing 50-hour weeks. On top of that, I was sometimes having a 3-hour commute each day. So all I could do over that 9-month period was get back home, make myself a decent meal, tumble into bed and do it all again the next day. So recognizing that I'd lost all those things that resourced me, I just didn't have time to do them. Now, we make space in our lives, don't we? When something extra comes in, we make space in our lives. And as a conscientious worker, I did that. And in doing that, I worked early, stayed late, worked through my lunch. And I know people do that, and we can do that, but we can only do it up to a period. Over a certain period of time, we're going to get tired from doing that. And that means we come into work not as good as we could be. Then when we're faced with the work that we have to do, when we're tired, we all know we don't think or do as well. That means we start feeling stressed. We start losing our confidence. We end up having to work late. And what we end up doing is in that, what I call a circle of decline. So the thing that I wish I'd learned was just how important all those activities that I did outside of work were to helping me rest and recover and relax.
And for me, again, and I will pass the mic in a moment, but immediately I see intersections there with work-related topics like hybrid. We are still seeing in early 2025 lots of headlines about organisations that have issued full return to the office mandates. And if you have become accustomed to working flexibly, working remotely, or some kind of hybrid arrangement, and all of a sudden you are now being recalled back to the office, and you've got to your point, factor that commute back into your day and all of the logistics that entails, but also all of the stresses. Like, one of the things that is just baffling to me is that footfall is increasing on public transport, but the actual services themselves haven't gone back to pre-pandemic levels. So if you have to get on a train in the morning and the evening to get to and from your place of work, you are not only re-experiencing the squeeze of the commute, but actually the squeeze of the commute is probably more squeezed because there are more people on fewer trains, buses, etc. So there's something there, isn't there, that the conditions by which we are now being expected to perform have changed, but there isn't a kind of public or open acknowledgement about the fact that those conditions have changed. And to your point, if we're not talking about them, then we won't be thinking about them. And your reflection is you wish that you had more of an awareness or appreciation of the absolute value and benefit of downtime. I think we tend to, in Western global North society, think about leisure time as cramming in a whole load of family stuff, like if you've got kids, all their activities, or I think there's a lot of kind of almost Instagram style perfectionist pressure to be seen, to be living your life in a certain way, which is glorifying busyness and accomplishment. And yet, actually, why was the weekend conceptualized back in the late 19th century, early 20th century to begin with? It was to create rest for the workers. I'm going off into a rabbit hole there, but no, all worth thinking about, I think.
I agree, Kat. And I think just tuning in, the thing that's cropping up in my mind as well is that the past that you talk about, the conceptualization, we've now had hybrid, but trying to put return to the office is kind of looming again. But going back to as well what you were saying at the beginning, Tracey, it feels like there's this kind of perfect storm happening where you talked about demand versus resource. So I think what we've got is a challenge in work where demand has never been higher, resource has never been lower, and the conditions and the environment we've created are from when perhaps, if we're trying to revert back to historical or previous times of mandates and commutes and all those things, we're not reducing the demand and resource to accompany that change of environment. So when that environment existed, perhaps the demand was lower or the resource was lower. So on. So it feels like this sort of perfect storm where all those things are clashing together, where you want more from me, I have less to give, less ability to deliver that, but you're also then the environment is now then not helping me to create the conditions to prioritize my burnout. Picking up on the things that you talked about with lessons learned. And I totally, it's so precious to have that time to rest and recuperate. And I say that as someone that does work hybridly now, and I work a lot, but having that taken out of my workload gives me the opportunity to do that. How do we, in organizations where they want more from us, but their resources limited, and manager, and Dom, I'm sure you'll pick up on this, managers aren't necessarily being trained to give the right relationships, constructs, conversations. How do we, when we feel so vulnerable and in certain times, better advocate for ourselves in the workplace to manage our burnout? Is that a lesson that you've learned in terms of how you stage that lesson learned, advocating for ourselves in a burnout world?
Yeah, so I think the biggest way to advocate for ourselves is to learn how to say no.
Powerful word.
And such a small world that has so much power. Yeah, and no doesn't mean not now either. You know, it can mean no, or if you're being asked to do something, especially for me, I already had a full job. I was head of marketing and comms at a marine consultancy. And what pushed me over the edge was being asked to bring in a new software system for customer relationship management. That's great. I'm a clever girl. I can do that kind of thing. I'm sure I was convinced I'd be able to bring it in. But nobody thought about, well, she's bringing that in. What else is she going to have to let go of? Because no one's sitting around with 20 hours spare for a new project to be brought in. So if you are being asked to do something else, then it's, well, help me prioritize, because there's only so much an individual can do. We're not machines.
Absolutely. It's such an important part, isn't it? And I think also, as well as internal communicators listening in, one of the things that we're probably sitting there thinking about as well is, well, we're in charge of change communication and change projects. There's no little time put to actually considering the impact of that and what that means for people's time and people's burnout and people's workload, as well as the workload for ourselves as well. And I think that we need to, as you say, advocate for that and kind of go, well, what do you want me to do with that time? And ask polite questions and say no and point out why. It doesn't have to be confrontational, does it? It can be also be positioned, and this is the benefits of, this is in the interest of the business to do it better and to do it in a more staged way. In my career, managing similar projects to what you've described, I think one thing I learned very early on is to manage expectations for my stakeholders, because you think you could do things really quickly and then you set yourself up to fail because you want to be seen as a yes person and a compliant person. Whereas actually what you end up doing is deliver a rush project, not done to the standard that you want, and it doesn't go as well. So I think we can really make those conscious conversations to mitigate that, and no is a powerful word, and prioritization is a powerful thing to do.
And just one more thing there is to recognize that there is a tension in being able to, even if you're struggling, that tension of being able to say no, or I've got all this, there's a tension between the employer expects you to do your job, not to say you can't. So that's a really difficult conversation to have, and having the confidence to have that conversation, empowering people to be able to have that conversation, ensuring that you've got a culture of openness where you can have that conversation and can say that this is my limit or help me prioritize. And I think especially with junior members of staff, they often find it really hard to recognize that they have the ability to not push back, but to say how things are for them rather than having to look like they're perfect at their job.
Tracey, listening to what you've said so far, I think you've certainly changed my view about what makes for burnout, because before we had this conversation, I would have said a lot of it was down to too much work, basically. I think from what I've understood from what you've said so far, of course that's a factor, but it sounds like the environment in which people work is even more of a factor. So yes, of course, if people have lots of work, it causes anxiety and stress. But if they're able to talk about it, to share the burden, if they're able to express their concerns, that goes a long way towards alleviating it. So it's sounding like burnout is often a factor about relationships, the ability to have conversations, like you said, but also control. To what extent can I control my workload, or at least have some sort of say in it? And so that leads me on to, I think, to look at what organizations can do, because I also listened to what Kat was saying. We're faced with a situation where all those factors, I think you talked about the demand and resources balance, all the factors around resources, many of them are under attack at the moment. So organizations, I was reading recently about this new machismo in organizations, perhaps spurred by the Musk agenda in America, but where the things which we're talking about, which may alleviate stress and burnout, are actually under attack. So I guess it would be good to go back over some of the key things that organizations can do to help people reduce their burnout, or at least manage their workload and have a healthier relationship with work. Sorry, very long question there, Tracey. What can organizations do?
Well, it's a really great question, Dom, because many tends to see work-related stress and burnout as the individual's problem, when really I see it as a manifestation of a health and safety issue in the workplace. And the reason I say that is because employers have a legal duty not only to look after the physical health of the individual, but the psychological health of the individual. And you do that by undertaking a stress risk assessment. And if you've never heard of one of those, you can find that on the Health and Safety Executive's website. And that asks you to look at all the systems and processes you have in place, and how even your decision-making processes, how they may be affecting workers. And that takes us straight to those resources, because the HSE recognises that there's 6 factors, working conditions, that can cause stress if they're not adequately managed. And rightly, as you say, John, one of those is control. One of those is workload. Another is relationship with your colleagues, relationship with your manager. Another one is change. As you said, Jen, you might be bringing something in and we haven't got time necessarily to think through that. But we need to think, if we're bringing those changes in, those are going to cause stress for some, not all, because some people embrace change. But all of those factors can be examined, and you're supposed to examine them. You have a legal duty to be doing that. And then from a manager perspective, you're closer to your people if you're a team leader. So you can use those factors in having conversations with people around what's going on for them. And especially if you're bringing in a new project and it's going to impact them around priorities. Did that answer your question?
It very much so, yes. So again, it goes back to this, I think a perennial thing for our podcast is around the ability of people to have good conversations. So it'd be really interesting just to get from your experience, Tracey, as a leader, as a manager, people might be saying, well, okay, I get that, but that's not an easy thing to do. So, and I know this could be a whole series of podcasts on this one topic, but what sort of things could managers and leaders do to start to approach those conversations? What questions might they be able to ask, or how might they frame the conversations in your experience? And I'm conscious that's a massive question.
Yeah, so I'll answer it from myself as having been a team leader in the past and a manager. I've always seen the people that work with me as humans first and worker second. So my conversations are, how are you doing? How is that going? In order to open the conversation, or I've noticed this, in order to encourage the person to have a conversation with me. But you can't just come in with those conversations if you've never been building a relationship with the individual in the first place, because there's no trust and safety between you and that person. So, and we see it time and again, don't we, that managers end up often in a management position because they're technically competent, capable, and very good at their role, but they're never given the training to be an effective people manager. And we saw it during lockdown, didn't we? That, you know, yes, you're a team leader and you've been supervising projects. You've actually been a project manager, a program manager, but now you're being asked to be a program manager and a people manager really for the first time.
And it's interesting. It's something we find quite a lot when we're training and supporting managers. They have the skills, but many of them don't feel it's appropriate to use them, or haven't felt it's appropriate to use them at work. And I think just by saying it is, you know, all these things are important to build a trust. And you certainly can't switch on going in on a Monday after you've done a course and saying, how are you doing? Because you're right, no one's going to tell you. You have to spend time building those relationships. But I think it's really important to emphasize to leaders that the skills they employ outside work are just as relevant, if not more so, in work. And that seems glaringly obvious, but I think lots of organisations have squeezed it out of their senior leaders.
Sorry, just really quickly to interject, because I know these threads are threads that we talk about on the podcast. This, to me, is where we need to, as professionals, expand the topic of soft skills. I think way too many organisations talk about soft skills and they don't dive into what that actually means. And I feel very strongly that we all have, well, for the most part, most of us possess the ability to relate with fellow human beings. But because we don't have the conversation about what the full spectrum of soft skills might entail, we create work environments where we're not encouraged to talk about those skills or even exhibit those skills. And certainly to your points about when you become a manager or a team leader, what training are you provided with? It typically tends to gravitate towards very functional, measurable aspects of the job rather than these more nebulous kind of contextual intricacies of what it takes to be a human in a web of interconnectedness.
I would agree. And I also think the phrase soft skills sets us down a bad path. I think that's the framing of them to begin with as soft skills doesn't position them as the essential requirement they should be. And I think that's been a perennial problem since the creation of skills terminologies and et cetera, et cetera. And I also think that I agree, we have the ability to connect as humans, but I also think that whilst we're talking about the responsibility of managers to make people feel safe, do they feel safe to be a human? So you can take that challenge upward and upward, because you can be a human being that wants to be a human, but you're like, in this world that we live in, oh, is that going to be a backlash for me? Will my company mind if I do it like that? Am I against a policy? This is this vicious cycle. We talk about culture starts from the top, doesn't it? And that behaviors that we display. And if they're not experiencing that, so it's quite a systemic issue that needs conversation to address, and it needs leadership change and buy-in to address, and how it's positioned and how we create the environments, because we all want to be good humans. I want to be a good friend. I want to be a good daughter. I want to be a good person. And we do take Dom's point, we take those things there. We do, but do we feel safe to display them as human beings in our environment? Which I think is a whole nother podcast, a whole nother topic in itself, which perhaps we shouldn't get into, but I think it's really important for us to keep talking about it. And it might feel like sometimes we're sort of screaming into the wind as internal communicators on the topic of manager communication. But if we don't keep screaming, you'll never be heard eventually. But with that being said, moving back to internal communicators, there's a lot of stuff going on around, this is the year where we do more with less. And I worry how much of a scary phrase that is, or an overwhelming phrase that is for us. We need to do more with less this year. You know, internal communicators ourselves are like having to deliver all the things we've talked about and challenged with that. And they know they need to say no. We know we need better prioritization. But I guess, Tracey, my question is, if someone is really in the midst of that burnout, work-related stress phase that they're in right now, and all those symptoms, that syndrome that you described earlier on, what sort of advice can we give to those internal communicators listening and go, that's where I feel right now? What advice would you give them?
Okay, so firstly, just to reiterate that if you're in that situation, if you're struggling, do not see it as a weakness. Tend to say that trees bend in a high wind, but if the wind blows for long and hard enough, the tree becomes misshapen. So true with human beings. We cope until we don't do so well. And then if I was working with you, then I'd do three things. I'd help you to manage the stresses. So think about what factors are in play. And whilst workload will be part of it, it's never just the single factor in play. Somebody that I worked with last year, when we did a stress audit, she had 11 things that would make things better for her. And so she set up a meeting with her manager and her manager's manager and got those things put in place. So think about those factors, do your own stress audit. If your workplace hasn't got one, then you can download one off my website. I'll give you a link for that if you put it in the show notes or something. The second thing to look at is manage yourself. So Jen mentioned earlier, want to do a good job, want to do it perfectly. Perhaps you're someone that says yes to things and haven't learned that no answer. So what are you doing that perhaps is unhelpful? So how are you thinking about things and what actions are you doing? So there's always the external stresses, but there's the internal stresses that you're putting on yourself as well. And then think about managing your capacity. So what are you doing to help yourself relax and recover outside of work? Because there are ways to bring that stress response down and how you're feeling. So, and if you need to take some time off, then do so, but come back and get those conditions changed. Because what we see, and you've probably come across it, is people will take time off. Oh, I need some time off. I'll have a break from work. And you're encouraged to. Your manager might encourage you to do it. But if the things don't change that have been causing the issue in the first place, then you'll be back in there within 4 to 6 weeks of going back.
Love that, Tracey. That's such practical advice, to do your own stress audit and find those conditions so that you can, and go back to, Dom, I'm going to throw to you now, but it's going back to that, those things that you can control and take forward.
If you use a framework, then that helps you feel more in control just by looking at those things, and it takes the emotion out of it. There's some questions, you answer them, and you just follow on.
So we've talked a bit there, Tracey, or a lot there, about how individuals can go about identifying their stress levels, I suppose, and then starting to do something about it. One of the things we also try and do in these podcasts is to give internal communicators some practical tips as to what they can do to help their organizations. And I think one of the great things about internal communication is we tend as practitioners to have our insight into all different parts of an organization. That gives us a good overview. So again, from your experience, having made sure that they're safe, if you like, as individuals, as communicators, they've done all they can to minimize their risk of burnout. I think, to borrow Kat's phrase, to make sure they put their oxygen mask on first. But then what can they do as communicators? What can we do as communicators to help other people across the organization manage that balance between demands and resources and minimize their burnout risk?
Okay, so obviously, because I was coming on this podcast, I had a bit of a think about what was relevant to you guys. So we all want to work in a sort of transparent and supportive environment. We want those good working conditions. So I think internal communicators are well positioned to be sort of embodying or modelling what a transparent and supportive means. So that could be both in your actions with each other and with your colleagues, but also in the communications that I'm sure you're putting out, in the information, etc. So that's the first thing that I think, that embodying it. And then secondly, support those company-wide stress risk assessments that, if they've never been done before, help the business to do that. And you'll know how to do internal campaigns around getting people to engage with that process. Then thirdly, helping managers to have those effective conversations, Dom, as you rightly point out, and to be compassionate when you're having those conversations. And then educating everybody on terminology, what burnout is, what work-related stress is, and giving people the tools and the means to look after themselves. And just to go back on a previous point, is that the manager does have a role to play. They can improve things for workers. So it isn't just a case of somebody presents with work-related stress and you signpost them to the EAP, because there is a responsibility within the workplace to do something first before you do the signposting. But yeah, so embodying what it means, how you would model being transparent and supportive, clear communication, supporting company-wide stress risk assessments, helping those managers, and then the education piece.
That's a very clear list. Thank you very much. I'll pass back to Kat in a second, but I just want to go back to the point about conversation just one more time on this, because it does strike me that if you have conversations early, and it's an obvious point, I suppose, but if you take the time to do it, you most likely will massively reduce the risk of a big problem happening down the line, which obviously is important for the individual in your team, but also for you as a manager, because, put it bluntly, you're more likely to get stuff done if your people are able to discuss things early. And I know that's an obvious thing, but I think it's something we can reiterate as communicators, because often we find we have to make the case to many managers why they should give time to this sort of thing. And I think you've highlighted a very good reason to support that case. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. And just to sort of tag on to that, Dom, it isn't even having conversations early. It's having conversations that just know and speak to your people.
I knew you would be a really good person to bring on and chat about this, because it is really, really, really important. It's like mission critical. And first and foremost, thank you so much. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for coming and chatting with us. I think this episode has certainly provided me with much greater clarity, and I imagine that it will have provided our listeners with greater clarity. The one thing that I do want to state, and I can't overstate it enough, is that if you're listening to this and you're working in internal comms, we have not created this episode to add to your to-do list in the sense of, you need to go out and protect all your colleagues from burnout. The entire point and purpose of this episode was to bring, hopefully, information and resources to you so that you feel better equipped and supported to do your vital work. Because, I mean, obviously we've got skin in the game when we say this, but we absolutely wholeheartedly believe that internal communication now is mission critical for future business and organizational success. But that's never going to happen if you yourselves trip over into burnout. And so if you take nothing else from this episode, just please look after yourselves. And within the IOIC community, if you're members, start a conversation with us, because we need to be open and honest with one another as to what our challenges are in order that we can better support one another. And the more we practice conversations, the better we become at conversations. And so it all hopefully positively spirals upwards. So thank you, Tracey, for coming. And hopefully we can have you back on at some point to talk about this in a bit more detail.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracey.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast episode. If you have, please like it and share it on your preferred digital channels. Help us spread the word to build a better, more connected and inclusive future of work.